Jesus was condemned to death by the Jewish Sanhedrin, but under Roman law, this was not something that they were allowed to execute by themselves, and so they handed him over to the Roman governor Pilate to be put on trial. Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Luke tells us that when the chief priests presented their charges against Jesus to Pilate, that they painted him as a type of insurrectionist, that he was against paying taxes to Caesar, and that as a Messiah, as a king, that he was ready to have the people rise up against the Roman Empire. And so Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you indeed a king?" And Jesus does not deny the charge, but he says that his kingdom is not of this world. But despite Jesus' answer, Pilate seems to believe that Jesus is no threat and indeed that he is innocent. And there are several reasons for this. When the charges are brought against Jesus, Jesus says nothing, which amazes Pilate. This did not seem to be the action of a guilty man. Pilate knows that it is out of envy that Jesus' accusers have handed him over to be put on trial. Pilate knows their motives, and it causes him to question whether or not Jesus was truly guilty. And Pilate receives an urgent message from his wife while he is in court, telling him to have nothing to do with this man. She told him that she had had a dream about this Jesus and had suffered much because of him. And so Pilate believes that Jesus is innocent. Now, each year at the Jewish feast of the Passover, the Roman governor had a tradition that he would, as a sign of his grace, release back to the people a prisoner. And Pilate's plan seems to have been this, that he would present to the crowd two options of two prisoners to release back to the crowd. One, Jesus, whom the crowds had been cheering as he entered into Jerusalem that week in the triumphal entry, or Barabbas, a notorious, known criminal and a type of terrorist. And he seems to be wanting them to choose to have released Jesus, and then he can go back to the religious leaders and the political leaders and tell them, "I'm sorry, this is who the crowd chose." This way, he would be able to release Jesus, whom he believed to be innocent, while still keeping his favor with the people. But the plan would not work out this way, for the chief priests had stirred up the crowd against Jesus. And so when Pilate brings before the crowd Barabbas, or Jesus Barabbas, and Jesus of Nazareth, and he asks them, "Who is it that you want me to have released to you?" they shout, "Barabbas." And Pilate said, "What should be done with Jesus?" And they shouted, "Crucify him." And Pilate said, "Why? What has he done?" And they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And so Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified, but he washed his hands of this, for he believed that Jesus was indeed an innocent man. And they took Jesus, and they beat him, and they mocked him, and they stripped him of his clothes, and they put a robe upon him and a crown of thorns upon his head. And then they put his clothes back on him, and they led him away to be crucified. So how about you? What do you think that Jesus was feeling through all of this? And how did he have the strength to stay silent? What does his willingness to die in this way say about Christ's love for us?